Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas. I'll be your host today, and we're going to be talking about designing emotionally driven games. Now, many games are fun, but few stay with us after the credits roll. So today, we're going to dive into how indie devs can use game mechanics, narrative, and aesthetic choices to create emotional resonance and meaning in their titles. From narrative tools to methods that focus on player empathy, we unpack the secrets behind making games that create a lasting impact. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey, everybody, and we're back. And today with us, I have Nicholas O'Brien. Nicholas, how's it going? And thank you so much for being here today with us.
Thanks so much, Andrew. It's going really well. It's hot here where I am, so things are heating up for the summer, but things are good.
Things are heating up. Well, they are here too. And I'd say probably here on the show today because we have some awesome things to talk about. But before we do that, for those of you who aren't familiar with Nicholas, he is the founder at SA Games, and he's also a visiting professor at Pratt Institute, which is pretty cool. I know growing up when I was looking at schools, Pratt was one of those, at least for film school and stuff. And man, they just such a great institution and everything. Outside of that, games that you have made and everything, one of which that I am familiar with, and there's so many great things about this one. Sorry, folks, but dad thing. Bundle of Joy, a dad sim indie game. It's on Steam, right? And what else do you have too? You have like at home, stay at home devs, five games and made in Godot. Or tell us a little bit about that. You're also an independent curator. Sorry, I'm kind of rambling through these things, but please tell us more about what SA Games is, Bundle of Joy, and all these other things you're involved with.
Yeah, totally. So Bundle of Joy is exactly like you said. It's a dad simulator mini game romp, I think is like the kind of one sentence pitch. But I would say it's like if you've ever played a WarioWare game or like a Bishi Bashi arcade game, it's like that, but you're taking care of a newborn kid. So the kid is between, kind of 0 to 6 months old. And it's based on personal experience of myself becoming a parent during the pandemic and trying to like create a cathartic space to examine and just give kind of voice to some of the difficulties that parents have in those early moments. And not just the difficulties of taking care of the kid, but also some of the kind of emotional changes and psychic changes that happen during those early months. Your world really radically changes. And so I wanted to make a game that was both playful and lighthearted, but also could address some of those kind of heavier issues that come about when you become a parent. And Stay at Home Dev is not myself, but I was recently featured on Stay at Home Dev, which is super cool. Julian is an amazing content creator, and runs a channel called Stay at Home Dev that does a lot of Godot-based content. And they do a kind of weekly highlighting of games that are featured on that platform or featured using that platform, using that engine. And I've made some other games before on Steam and Itch and also on the Nintendo Switch. That's an experimental, much more prosy based game that's about kind of global supply chains and culpability within large systems of power. Yeah. So I hope that answers those initial questions. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm about. And SA Games is a studio that I started in Brooklyn. It's mostly myself with some small contractors and small but very important contractors. And yeah, we make introspective narrative-based games that are thinking about how to be nuanced and delicate with complex materials like early parenthood and stuff like that.
Yeah, and that's definitely what we're going to be diving into in a moment. And I have to call out too, like with Bundle of Joy, I remember so Nicholas and I met at MagFest this year in 25,
Mhm.
and when I was seeing that game from a distance, I was like just laugh out loud laughing because like so many of the things in there were I'm like, wow, this is extremely relatable too. So if you ever want to know what it's like to be a parent, like maybe you're planning in the future, maybe you want to give yourself a confirmation of why you don't want to be a parent. Well, like I would say just check out the game. And, as you're saying that, I was thinking, what could emphasize this even more, get you more into the moment is maybe like have it like an all night challenge. So you're doing these things all night to really have that lack of sleep factor sink into.
Yeah, there's so the game is structured. That's so funny. The game is structured in this kind of daily cycles. So you go through kind of a 5 day period of trying to survive and not stress out. But one of the people that was advising on the project, said, "Oh, would you ever imagine doing like an endless mode?" I was like, I don't know if I really want to ever put somebody
Yeah,
through that.
right.
That sounds like so
They do get older.
intense. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But also, like, I don't know if anybody could have incurred that much stress. Like, that's kind of the central mechanic and conceit of the game is that you're trying to perform these mini games without stressing out, right? And stressing out, it is inevitable and it's part of the game and it's part of
Life.
the kind of system and it's a part of life, absolutely. And the game doesn't punish you for those things, but instead it kind of unlocks these other elements and these other vignettes that happen as a result of it. So yeah, I was just like, I don't know if I want an endless mode, just like constantly stressing out. That sounds pretty intense.
Yeah, definitely. But anyways, I digress, but still lots of fun things there. But yeah, so we appreciate you sharing a little bit about yourself, but before we get into the conversation, would love to learn a little bit more. And how we do that here on the show is have you go through the Q Box round. And folks, Q Box round, for those of you who aren't familiar, is just a few random questions we prepared here for Nicholas today. So, Nicholas, are you ready for the Q Box round?
I hope so. I'm as ready as I'll ever be.
Excellent. All right. First question is, what is your biggest gaming pet peeve?
Yeah, I love this question. It's such a good question. I think the way that I conceptualize this is just a single sentence, which is Clementine will remember this. And for anyone out there that's played narrative games or played the Walking Dead Telltale games, it's a very narrative focused, conversation focused type of gameplay experience. And you do certain things, sometimes morally dubious given the circumstance of existing within the Walking Dead universe. And characters, react and respond. And so it's a very agency driven type of experience. But what really drives me crazy about that, I really enjoy the writing and I really enjoy the complex characters and the complex relationships that those characters have with one another. But what drives me nuts is that in that game, when you do something or you make a choice or you do something that maybe is against the moral compass of some of your companions, there's a little thing up in the upper right hand corner that says so and so will remember that. And it's this kind of visual cue that basically, in my mind, quantifies this very real emotional connection that you're having with a character. And it reduces the potential impact of that relationship to just like a bullet point on the screen. Yeah, and that's one of my biggest pet peeves of just like quantifying narrative decision making and kind of especially branching narrative decision making. And I think that players are now getting more astute and also more kind of quote unquote literate to be able to not have such kind of quantified and holding. Some games do this, I think, a little bit too much. And it just like really drives me nuts because I really want to be immersed in that conversation and really be, kind of engrossed in what my relationship is and could be and might become. And having this kind of pop up on the screen that's, yeah, quantifying the decisions that I made really kind of reduces that emotional impact.
Oh, I absolutely love it. Such a good one right there. And, rightfully so for, you're someone like yourself and the focus of your studio and everything and what we're going to be talking about in a moment. But next is name one thing that motivates you every day.
Yeah, I think a thing that motivates me every day is my family. I know that's maybe like a somewhat of a cheesy answer or a canned answer or maybe a little bit too predictable in terms of the game that we just talked about, Bundle of Joy. But I really do feel like just waking up, having breakfast with the kids and my partner and, talking about what's coming up during the day and also kind of picking them up from school and hearing about what the day was, there's just life and energy and curiosity and excitement and They see the world through such a wonderful perspective. And I don't know, I think that they also know that I'm a game designer. So when they see me working on stuff, they want to like see what's going on. And my eldest is a really good play tester. She's really good at finding bugs. So she motivates me to fix those things when she
Nice.
finds them. So yeah, so I'd say my family for sure.
Oh, that's yeah. I love those reasons too. I think what's funny sometimes, which is I don't know if what I would call this, but I love it when my after a while my son has finally figured out what I do for a living essentially and involved in games,
Hmm.
and then he starts asking me all these questions about how I can talk to the developers at Fortnite and how I can help influence some changes that he wants. And well, it's not that easy, unfortunately. So
That's like the my uncle works at Nintendo kind of thing.
yeah,
Like don't yeah, it's funny, but it's also super sweet. That's so nice.
yeah. All right, last but not least, and the staple here on the show is what game are you playing now?
Yeah, I actually I mistyped when I was writing out these questions for myself, and I'm replaying right now the Outer Worlds as part of an upcoming talk, which we can talk about in a little bit. But yeah, I had played it before. I don't think I ever actually finished it, but I really remember the narrative design system that Obsidian made for that game. And I'm working on a talk that's kind of talking about narrative design systems. So I'm replaying it both to get some footage and some screenshots for the talk, but also to like remind myself why it was like so powerful and evocative and just really structurally well designed. So yeah, the Outer Worlds. And I guess, yeah, the sequel's coming out soonish. So maybe a little bit of preparation for that.
Sweet. Well, thanks so much for sharing more about yourself, Nicholas, and what you're getting into. Lots of great stuff in that cue box around folks. But now let's get to the discussion, why we're here today. And again, as I said in the intro, it's about designing emotionally driven games. So, to kick things off, you know, you shared a little insight about your games, kind of the focus of your studio and everything. Like, you described your games as essentially in a way like, as introspective and, message driven. So I'm curious, like what first drew you to that style of design?
Yeah, it's a really good question to kick things off. I think what initially drew me to them was that I come from a fine art background. So I was never like kind of quote unquote classically trained as a game designer. I was trained as an artist, as a fine artist working in a gallery or a non-for-profit setting. And a lot of the work that I did as an artist was really trying to make films and videos and interactive artworks that had a kind of specific message, right? Had a specific theme, had a specific kind of content, which is a weird way of phrasing it, but a specific message, right? They were all about a topic, a thing. They weren't just purely abstract or art for art's sake. They were some form of critique, or they were some form of reflection, or they had this kind of approach to making that was kind of my personal view on something based on research or talking to experts or just some personal experience and so on and so forth. So when I was starting to make more interactive artworks, that kind of naturally spewed into thinking about games, right? And I started playing a lot more games, or started continuing to play a lot more games that were in an indie space, that were making something that was message driven, making something that had this kind of personal take, this individual take on a potentially very complex issue. And what drew me to that was, thinking about how you can create something and design something that had a lot of moving parts, narrative, visual design, interactive design, sound, right? All of these different components, and bring them together to say something, to not merely just tell a story, but to have that story talk about something maybe topical, perhaps even political, or that had a very specific kind of message delivered in its kind of core design. And that really excited me, both as an artist and as a person that likes media that has a kind of point, that has some kind of specific meaning to it. Sometimes that meaning can be a little bit abstract or a little bit diffuse, but I really like work and art and artists that have something to say with their within their medium, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and you know what? I love that approach too because how often do we see, in any circles in the industry, right? Where we're talking about how, and it's always been that controversy, especially with Roger Ebert around games as art. And it's just really interesting to hear your perspective on it because it's like that makes complete sense and about all these other things and stuff. And it just I don't know, it can really, that concept and idea that you just expressed, I think really does an effective job. And we're not here to have that debate because that's been like beginning since time, or at least time with games. But I love that perspective, and I think it's for me, what I heard at least was a really solid point on that whole art concept and direction, which I love hearing. In light of that, though, you talked a lot about like, some of the messages, some of the thoughts and emotions, and all these things. So when you're,
Mm.
you know, designing an emotional experience, like where do you start? Because I imagine like
Yeah.
the ideas and everything you mentioned could be potentially overwhelming, exciting, but even overwhelming. Like, is it something as specific as starting with the narrative, the mechanics, or could it be something else entirely different?
Yeah, that's another excellent question. I think it can differ for different designers. So I want to kind of preface what I'm about to say with saying like this is how I do it, but I think that there's many ways to approach this kind of design challenge. I think I really like pre-production. I'm like a big proponent of pre-pro. It's like something that I really enjoy. I like doing research. I like doing Kanban boards. I like doing mind maps. I really like that process of thinking about, okay, what are all of the moving pieces that I need to kind of wrangle in order to make this thing, right? And so I think in that process, in that pre-pro, I really try to like nail down what are those emotional beats, right? And even just like writing out not even narrative, but what are the emotional touch tones of a piece, right? So for Bundle of Joy, we were just talking about, I knew that I wanted to convey this sense of stress, right? And I wanted to create something that had both stress and relief, right? I wanted there to be a tension. And that was really interesting to me to design something that could contain that tension, right? That could be both, something that was making you clam up and tighten up, but also give you the sense of like relief, right? Because I think so much of parenting is that push and pull, right? That push and pull between feeling like I have no idea what I'm doing and like, oh no, I got this. Like I'm totally okay. And so in the kind of pre-production of that, I created a lot of prototypes, right? I created a lot of different uh, initial builds of what I thought it was. And some of those had a lot more narrative, right? But what I found was that I think all types of games and all types of media are most effective when they're not telling the player what to feel or what the message is, but instead are letting the medium convey that more innately, right? Through various techniques, right? So if I wanted things to be stressful, right, then I needed to, create a design that got the blood going, right? Got the blood rushing. So something that was fast paced, that had a lot of activities, and maybe those activities were different, right? They weren't the same activity. We weren't just button mashing all the time, right? So keeping you on your toes, making you think, making you pay attention, right? That became this very core component to how the game worked, right? So with message driven games, I think a lot of it has to be with what are those core emotions that you're going for. And in your pre production of a project, really thinking about what mechanics can match those emotional touchstones, right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point too because, like, again, you prefacing saying, "Hey, look, this is kind of like my approach. There's probably lots of approaches." But I mean, when we're dealing with the emotion, and again, you called out to this before, it can be fairly abstract and
Mm,
and and elements of that, aspects, whatever. And when you're taking those things and trying to articulate it or translate it in a way that like, hey, mechanic like narrative, that kind of makes sense, right? I think a lot of us understand a concept like, oh, what constitutes a sad theme, a sad story, or a happy story, right? They're kind of very basic things that we're all familiar with ever since we were kids. But when it comes to mechanics, it doesn't always translate well. So the example that you just provided was great because it's like, hey, look, this is a thing that's happening that I'm experiencing being a parent, and there's this stress and then relief. And I'm sure any parents listening can kind of release that. So like, oh my god, my kids are driving me nuts. To, oh my god, they're so cute.
Right,
Right?
right.
And but it's like, well, how do we articulate or how do we translate that into a game? And then, as you laid out, those tensions, like, and it's like, hey, there's stakes involved, and then there's other things, and then actually calling out to some level of like player agency, right? Because you're like, well, I don't want just button mashing, and
Totally.
then from what you're doing is outlining like how these core emotions, and then finding those ways to how are they connected? How can they be translated in some way, shape, or form to those mechanics? And then I guess like from there, I mean, I guess where else do we go to kind of build off of that? Is it kind of like I would say that in part of that initial concept is then find like as they say, like finding the fun, right? And kind of exploring from that and then, going from there. I mean, at that point, as if you're starting to, let's say, map out those core emotions with those mechanics, like what else after that do we try to like account for or consider? Because I know you called out before, it's like, hey, I didn't want to like take away the agency either from players because that's just as important as everything else. But is there
Mm.
anything else to account for?
Yeah, I think one of the things, kind of building off of what you were saying, Andrew, is I think one of the things that I really try to stress as a designer and as an educator is really thinking about how to utilize contrast, right? Not just visual contrast, not just something being in shadow and something being highlight, but really thinking about contrast in terms of game play, right? So having stressful moments are then contrasted with moments of contemplation and relief and slowness, right? Having moments of uncertainty are then contrasted with moments of very minimal type of interaction, right? So, to me, I think contrast is such a effective tool, an effective design tool to utilize to get the player or get kind of any audience member across media to get into the kind of headspace that you want to get them into, right? It's why I think, for instance, RPGs have like campfires, right? It's like thinking about something like Baldur's Gate, or even more recently, like Clair Obscur. Like these games, they have these moments of exploration and adventure and battle and encounters and so on and so forth. But then they have these moments of respite, right? And it's in those moments of respite where the narrative really comes to light. Your relationship with the other characters really develops, right? And some of those are really hardwired mechanically, and some of those are more kind of like soft wired, I guess you can say, to bring flavor to the game. But they're there for a reason, right? They're not just there to be like, oh, I'm going to, stretch out gameplay, right? But it's because they provide a moment of contrast for the player to feel like they're not just kind of constantly being pushed forward, right? So I think that contrast can be a really, really helpful design tool to get your players in the headspace that you want to get them into. Yeah, and I think like a lot of that has to happen through prototyping. A lot of that has to happen through, figuring it out along the way. So when you're designing a game or you're designing a project, sometimes you might have these emotional touchstones that you're wanting to hit, right? These things that you're working on in your pre-pro. But then in the actual implementation stage, right, when you're in production and you're doing play testing, you need to be observant and also receptive to the feedback of the people that you're getting to hopefully play test your game, to see like, oh, are these emotional moments landing, right? Or are players coming away from that experience having the emotional feelings that I want them to have, right? In the case of Bundle of Joy, like, are they feeling stressed when they should be feeling stressed? And are they feeling relief when they should be feeling relief? And so you're trying to guide the player through the design process to, yeah, meet those emotional beats, right? Yeah, and I think the other thing that you have to account for, I think something that oftentimes doesn't get accounted for enough is like feel, game feel. This is something that I really struggle with. It's like, do you, even if you're putting the player in a moment of uncertainty and maybe not understanding fully what they might be doing long term, does the game give enough instruction and guidance to the player to have them feel like whatever it is that you're throwing them into, they can pick up a controller and, experiment and figure out what it is that they need to do? And so being mindful of game feel as a designer, I think, is also a really necessary part of that process of making sure that you're guiding the player through whatever those messages or emotional states that you want them to receive.
Yeah, because I mean, honestly, I think all of us here know, or at least familiar to an extent, of how sometimes tutorials can be very ineffective in executing on that, and or just for gameplay in general, right? But then if you're adding that emotional factor too, it's like it. I don't think any tutorial is really, well. I mean, by even by design, it's not, generally won't execute on that unless it's like baked into part of the overall experience, and which is always something, it's a challenge, and always something we probably strive for. you know when you were talking about and giving some examples about emotional weight, I was it got me thinking more. I wouldn't mind exploring this a little bit more either, and getting your thoughts on it too, because I mean, what you provided were really, really good examples, and some things that were hitting my head. And I don't know, maybe in game design terms, there's actually a term for this, but sometimes I notice too, where when you're getting into gameplay, and let's say there's certain features or other mechanics that happen, and sometimes they just feel completely unrealistic. But I think, and let me phrase better phrase that too. When it gets unrealistic, it's more like they're unrealistic in terms of the environment, the setting, the expectations that were already set for this particular experience, right? So, for example, if you're playing a fantasy game and all of a sudden your form of magic is really no different than you using tools that we have access to in modern day, and that's what they call magic. That might seem a little off, right? Not believable. And I guess there's that factor that I'm getting to, is like, how is there an element of believability within your game setting that can also help emphasize emotional weight? And like a classic example I always think of is, like, let's say if you're playing a survival game, and it's like you're walking around and, oh, I have limited resources and I need a battery for my flashlight. Where is a logical place? Like, there's that believable factor, which that I would see in those situations add more emotional weight. Like, are those things important to kind of consider for? And again, I think it varies depending on the project and what that setting is. But what's your take on that in terms of using that also as a form of adding emotional weight?
Yeah, for sure. When you started asking the question, you kind of posed it as like, are these like official terms, or are they like, things that designers look to to kind of set the stage, if you will,
Hmm.
right? Of what should be the expectations or guidelines, right, of a certain game world. And I wouldn't say that there's universal terms. I really like using terms that have been outlined by a game educator and a game theorist and a game designer, Tracy Fullerton, who talks about there being these game design considerations. And she kind of lists them out. There's, I think, 9 of them. Let's see. Yeah, something like that, 9 of them. Anyways, doesn't matter. But in these considerations, sorry, Tracy, if you ever hear this, but in these considerations, 2 of the considerations that I think really touch on what you're talking about, and one of them is called procedures, and one of them is called boundaries. And boundaries are, you can think of as like the conceptual space in which a game takes place, right? And it's this like temporary world where you kind of like buy into, right? You opt into, you volunteer to participate in, right? So as a designer, you have to make sure that those boundaries are very clear and lucid to the player, right? Not just by rules, right? But through visual design and through interactive design and through tutorialization. And obviously, like, those things are really important. But the other kind of core consideration that I think speaks to this is this thing called procedures, right? Which you can kind of think about as literally being the action verbs or methods, right, of what you do within the game, of what the gameplay is. And that those are kind of precipitated by the rules of the game, right? So you pick up, you scavenge, you explore, you shoot, you weep, whatever it is, right? Whatever those action verbs are, those can be think of as the procedures for advancing through the game, right? And I think that those from like a very kind of granular thought process of how to go about design, I think the combination of those two things can really think about, yeah, both setting the stage, but then giving the player a vocabulary, right, for how to engage with the world, right? And this is like, again, done through tutorialization, right? I think good tutorialization uses those procedure based action verbs to get the player engaged, right? They don't say, it's never passive voice. It's never like, if you would like to, right? It's never like, you might by chance do this thing. It's like, go here, right? Do this, walk this way, follow the marker, right? Whatever it might be. Yeah, in Bundle of Joy, it's like change baby's diaper, right? It's these action verbs, right? These commands, if you will, to incentivize the player to then, follow the procedures of what the rule set is within the game to advance either the story or to advance through the world or to explore something and gain knowledge, et cetera, level up, whatever it might be.
Yeah, and thank you so much. And again, I forgot the first one. It was the procedures and those two things.
Boundaries.
Thank
Yeah,
you. Boundaries. Yeah, thank you for that because it's like I always think of things this way, and it's really cool because if we go back to what you were talking about a moment ago about finding those core motions, mapping that out to more core mechanics, and then taking the what you just outlined in terms of like the boundaries and then procedures. I mean that sounds like effectively it could be kind of a good framework to work from, especially if you're now applying that whole emotional weight lens because if and it sounds like something you probably do inherently or at least you've done this in time as you have grown as a educator and a developer where this is part of almost like your own internal framework where it's like hey we have these things and I'm not obviously speaking on your behalf here, but what I'm picking up, it sounds like we've got these core motions, we've mapped it to mechanics, and we have these boundaries and procedures set. So in a way, this is almost like a good formula. It's like not necessarily formula, but something that people can use to, you know, apply these to the emotional weight we're looking for, and what are maybe interesting or unique ways that we can apply emotional weight.
yeah, for sure. And I want to just make sure I'm really just like cribbing from Tracy Fullerton, and these are concepts that are outlined in this really incredible book called Game Design Workshop, which I would highly recommend to all of your listeners. It's a textbook. It's like a very formal textbook, but it outlines these kind of design concepts that I think that designers kind of intuit in a lot of way, and certainly players will recognize within different game worlds. But I think it's something that I think as a resource and a reference is just really, really important and valuable to kind of give that vocabulary structure to, and sometimes to kind of confirm, if you will, some of those innate things that you might be observing. One of those considerations, for instance, that is outlined by Tracy Fullerton is conflict, right? And again,
Mm.
I kind of term that as contrast, right? That's this thing, this push and pull. Conflict is a little bit more specific in which you have an obstacle, right, to overcome in some way. And so for me, I think like, yeah, that's a super important element. But then how do you kind of balance the conflict with not necessarily even resolution, but in my case, as a designer that's thinking about more kind of emotional weight, how do you then contrast that against another mode of gameplay that gets the player into whatever the mission or the statement is that you want to be delivering.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow, I mean, so many great things there. You, you know, we talked a lot about these concepts, how we can actually implement on them, and everything else. But let's face it. I mean, part of things that make all this happen isn't just us, but it's also the tools that we use.
For sure.
And I'm just curious from the emotional, the narrative, side of things, and what we're here talking about. How do these tools influence your design choice? Like, are there any particular that you use that help, or just know of others in general that have certain features that can really help shape the design?
Yeah, totally. It's a great question. And I love talking about tools, actually. It's like one of my, and I think a lot of designers do. It's just like, it's like talking shop, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
it's a fun thing. So I really like using open source tools just for many different reasons, but the primary reason is that I really enjoy the community of those tools. I like being able to talk to a range of individuals that use tools that are not just like the whatever cogs in a machine that are professional users, but are potentially also amateur users or developers that are developing tools within the software. So yeah, so I develop in Godot, which is an open source game engine. I love working in that engine, and it's gotten a lot of really great community support recently. And I actually just presented at Godot Con, which was great. It was the first time it happening in the States in Boston. It was really great. I had a super good time. I hope it comes back to the States next year. And so, yeah, so that's one tool that I use a lot. I also, for all my 3D modeling, I use Blender, which is another open source tool. I love Blender. I'm like not as up on what's happening in Blender right now as I used to be. I used to be a real kind of like Blender gearhead, and because I used to do a lot more photorealistic rendering and modeling, and I've fallen off of that a little bit just because of like work changes, and then Bundle of Joy as modeled to be much more cartoonish and non-photoreal and stuff. So I'm not like super up on what's happening with it right now, but the things that I have been seeing are really, really incredible, especially actually in the non-photoreal department. There's some amazing things that are being happening in that tool. And the Blender Studio is making a Godot game right now, which is super exciting. And then the last tool that I use, especially for narrative design and writing and technical narrative design work, is a tool called Inky, which uses the Ink language. It's developed by a studio that's called Inkle. This is a lot of inks. But yeah, they're a UK based studio. They made games like 80 Days and a Highland Song more recently, and the Overboard series. It's a really amazing tool that they developed that is an open source tool that does branching narrative very, very well. And you can bake in variables, and you can bake in some functions and some switches and a little bit of logic right within the software or right within the tool. And yeah, it's all text based. So sometimes that's a little bit hard to manage. It doesn't have like a user interface like Twine or like Artisy Draft or anything like that, other narrative design tools. But I find it's really great for making branching narrative and making variable based dialogue, even if it's not dialogue or monologue. I think that that's also really something that's fun about the tool, is that you can use it to both read and send variable data quite easily because it just outputs a JSON file. So that can be very parsable and very easy to, how could you say, read and write to from a design perspective.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think it's just one of those things a lot of us like, love sharing our tools and stuff, especially learning about new ones that, could help with things. And I mean, and you made some good points too about like everything from, your use of Blender, or even more recently, not as much because of, the choices. I mean, what the project needed or entailed and stuff, and how the project aligns with certain tools is always important. I don't know if we really talked about it much and don't have like too much time, but I do know and familiar with like you have to some degree, in a way like experimentation with like different project types and such. You for example, you could talk about it briefly, but I know that there's a like a visual novel, like kind of an experimental visual novel you have done and stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
and maybe you could use it that or others as an example, but like for others of us that are out there, whether we're experimenting, and maybe that's just to be something different, or just experimenting as a prototype for our next project, whatever the case is, how do you go about balancing experimentation, with clarity, especially if we're going along the lines here of that focus that's meant to have or evoke even a specific message?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Experimentation is tough because I have, to a certain extent, a lot more room for experimentation as a solo developer, right? Like I'm not beholden to shareholders, right? I'm not beholden to, currently, I'm not beholden to like a funder, right? That has a specific timeline or a release date in mind or a desire for some ROI, right? Some return on investment. So, to some extent, I have a lot more time and availability to do, yeah, experimentation, research and development, and stuff like that. But I think that another way of answering that question is that I really always try to come back to this idea of what would be a game that I would like to play, right? Like, I really believe that that can be such an amazing guiding force for thinking through those experimentation phases, right? I think that like following a zeitgeist can sometimes lead to dangerous and somewhat constrictive design decisions. There's a YouTuber, I can't remember who it is right now off the top of my head, so apologies to them, that released this video recently that was about kind of game design. Is the developer of this indie game called Tower or Throne Fall Tower or
Oh,
something like that.
okay.
It's like a tower defense game.
Yes. I know.
Yes.
Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about, but I can't think of them too. But
No, yeah.
they've made a few other games,
They
and they've
have.
had
Yeah.
a channel for a while and everything.
They have.
Um,
Absolutely.
yeah. So,
Absolutely.
anyways, I think
They
most of us probably listening probably know exactly who we're talking.
We
But
can put it in the show notes.
yeah.
Yeah, that's totally cool. But they released this video somewhat, or maybe not so recently anymore, a couple of years ago, that was kind of about depth, design depth, and how you try to plunge different depths with your design to think about how to create a game that potentially doesn't have a ton of features, but the features that you do design it have a ton of potential replayability or a potential strategy element to them, and you can kind of drill down into that mechanic quite far. And I think that for a lot of designers, this is very helpful feedback and very helpful way of ideating through the process. But for mission driven games, I find it completely absurd because I'm not necessarily looking for strategic depth for getting a very wide, broad base of players that are potentially like chasing the zeitgeist of what the next hit indie game is. That's just me. I'm really thinking about like, oh, what's the emotional depth, right, that I want to plunge with the games that I'm making. And thinking about what design choices can complement that depth, I think, is really where the studio is based within. So yeah, so thinking about like, oh, what is the game that I think that I would like to make that's talking about this particular issue, and thinking about how those things can potentially pair up, right? Are there ways that those things make sense together? Are those ways that those things don't make sense together? So maybe you need to find a different mechanic. All of those things I think are worth exploring within a pre-production. And then yeah, like really trying to do quick jam like prototyping, right? You're never going to know really if things are working unless you go through the design process. As an example, Bundle of Joy, the initial prototype for that game was a walking simulator, and it just like didn't work. It was like not very innovative, it was not very interesting. The like emotional vulnerability that I wanted players to, exist within just wasn't there, right? It never landed. And even though I like walking simulators as a genre, it just didn't fit the gameplay, right? It just didn't fit the message. So that was a hard lesson because I spent, 6 months developing a prototype and basically had to throw out most of the prototype and start over. But through making that prototype, there was a mini game in that initial design, and that mini game led me towards this eventually what became Bundle of Joy, because what I found was that was the most interesting part, both from a design perspective and from getting the emotional payoff that I was looking for. So yeah, so in terms of experimentation, a kind of a combination, I would say, of really thinking about the kind of game that you would want to design yourself, thinking about what is the emotional depth of what that genre might offer, and then yeah, doing some prototyping, doing jam like instances of what you're thinking about, a jam like designs that then you can come back to over and over again and refine or scrap or yeah, continue to develop however you think that it's being received.
Yeah, I love that you called that out specifically, like that emotional depth. And another way that I like to look at that too, and what you're describing is really just essentially, identifying like what that purpose is of that project. Like what is the intent? And
Mm,
you provide some really great examples there and just like really trying to figure out like, hey, I want to convey this type of message and what that is. And then going back to what you're saying too, like it was great to hear how the initial prototype of Bundle of Joy was like, hey, I like walking simulators. I'll make it as that. And but then you really had defined really well what that intent was. What is the
mm.
emotional weight? What's a feeling I want people to get when they're picking this up? And you're like, it's not doing it. It's not doing it. So, but like, sometimes I think we might look at kind of like sunk cost. Well, I put all this time into this walking sim, so do you do you now shift? But then if you're shifting and now it's like, well, now you need a new purpose and everything else, and it almost seems like a backwards way of how you would design something anyways. Which I would say it's not to say that it's not possible and that could be a much needed change and work for people, but in theory, at least talking right now here, it seems like that could be maybe the wrong move for some people like that, where it's like in your case, you're like, I have this vision and I'm going to stick to it. And then you look at what you had created so far and you're like, oh, that can work. And then boom, you're like, yes, it's doing what it's checking all those boxes on that emotional impact I'm looking for.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that even though I had to quote unquote scrap, right? Like a lot of that initial prototype for Bundle of Joy, and it was just a completely different game in a lot of ways. Even though I had to like shelve that stuff, uh, I learned a ton doing that. Like I learned a ton about like workflow and design and integrating assets, and it moved me a lot closer to the eventual visual design that I settled on. It did move the needle in a lot of different ways, right? And I was able to incorporate some of the writing that I had done there into the final project, or at least some of the writing ideas, even if it wasn't the exact like text, one for one. So, it's not, even if you're like, oh, I gotta scrap this, right? Not all is lost, right? It's
Yeah.
never, forgive this pun, but it's never the baby with the bathwater, right? It's
Yeah.
like never all of it in one fell swoop. I think it's important for designers to think about like being able to pivot when they need to, and being able to find a creative solution to, yeah, deliver the message that they want to, and to have the intent match the outcome, right? I think that
Yeah.
that's like really, really important.
Yeah. And, I don't think that can be enough of a reminder for people. I, I think we all deal with that at some point. Like, oh, I just spent all this time doing this. And it's like, well, yeah, you did. You can't get it back. So what can you take away from it? Right. Because too often, and then we might be too hard on ourselves and it just doesn't, make a good way forward. So, you know, as we get ready to close here, I have one last question too, because as we stated earlier, we know you're an educator and everything, and as one, and this is really applicable to anybody, but like, how do you encourage, let's say, either students or people starting out, or honestly anybody, like someone working on their next project that maybe want to explore things a little and do things a little differently, to bring concepts like vulnerability or even personal themes into their work? Because and hopefully it's not too much of a loaded question, because I know that could be really challenging for people, like what's too much or asking who really cares and things like that. But
100%. Yeah.
if we're bringing these aspects that are true and authentic, and that's our intent, that's our purpose and our message that we want to get out there, what are some good ways that maybe that can be done in some way, shape, or form?
Yeah, it's a big question. It's a really big question. And I totally appreciate you asking. And I think that what I would say is look to other games that are finding really amazing supportive audiences that are doing that work already, right? I would say like for me, a big touchstone for some of the maybe not design motivations, but certainly thinking about the potential audience overlap was a game called Venba. And Venba, for anybody that doesn't know, is a really beautiful short narrative game that's about identity and an immigrant experience, and shifting between kind of a cultural perspective of your ancestors and a new cultural perspective that you're trying to grapple with, and trying to find a sense of belonging and home within that tension, right? Again, we're talking about tension. But for me, what I found like so compelling about that project was, yeah, how vulnerable it was, how willing it was to be not saccharine, right? Like not just overwhelming with emotion and, trying to be tear jerky or anything like that, but instead being very honest about not knowing how potentially the narrative stuff would land, right? It was kind of a little bit of a gamble, I think, for the developers and designers, and they had some really good feedback rounds and had some really good community support to keep going, which is amazing. But I think also something that they did that I would really encourage a lot of designers to do that are doing message driven games is to be okay with ambiguity. I oftentimes think that narrative designers and game designers sometimes really want to wrap things up in a very nice bow, right?
Mhm.
Like, really want to have something that's like, oh, this feels super succinct and super clear, and, or has a very rewarding dénouement, right? Like the action climax happens and it has this very conclusion, very nice conclusion, right? Uh, I think that's great. And I love games that do that. But I think sometimes allowing a player to be in an ambiguous space, being in an uncertain space, and then filling in the blanks on their own can be the way where you, let them cross the finish line, right? Instead of being like, okay, now at the end of this you feel sad, or what, or you feel hopeful, or you feel vulnerable, or whatever it might be, right? You leave room within the narrative for the player to fill in those emotional gaps, right? And to be okay as a designer with them potentially filling in the gaps with something that you didn't expect or you
Yeah.
didn't intend, right? I think that kind of letting loose a little bit, or loosening one's grips on the reins a bit, can be actually a really emotionally charged and powerful reward as a designer. Yeah, because then you get to see like how the thing that you made lands with potentially a very wide array of audiences.
I love that you called that out too, because as you're saying it, two things hit my mind. One is the last point there is just like, think about it, because there are so many nuances in us. I mean, when I say us, people, right?
Mm,
We all
mm,
have different interests. There could be different triggers for things. There could be different a variety of things. So approaching things with some level of ambiguity is perfect, because there's like you're really doing, you're really addressing whatever that audience is, and doing so in a much broader way. You're making that experience a lot more accessible. And in doing so too, like when you talk about rewarding, just think about like when the way I envision what a reward may look like and something like that is where you're creating a memorable moment for people, but those moments mean very different things to different people. So if they're
mm.
so it's more likely to promote conversations, word of mouth type stuff, like, oh, I love this part when this happened, and someone's like, wait a minute, what are you talking about? And then these discussions are happening and people are realizing like, oh, I get it now why you would feel that way, and they're having the same, sentiment. Like that is a like super awesome, powerful thing that I think is capable by what you basically said at, hey, we don't necessarily need to be rigid and put these bows on things. And then on the flip side, as you were talking about the bow part, I'm currently playing, because I just get a kick out of it, is Paper Mario and the Origami King. And there is a moment where they're very, in the narrative where it's very clear they did an amazing job with it, where there's some humor. And then you're like, I know where this is going, as a humor part. And then you're like, okay, I guess it's not going there. And then, oh, it did go there. And I was like, wow, they constructed that so well. But it's like, I saw it a mile away. I
Right.
enjoyed it. But and yes, I'm having, so it's like different types of memorable moments. And I think for Nintendo, that makes sense, right? But for us indies, I think, man, there's so much more power in that and potential that we have to do something that is a little bit broader, that is a little bit ambiguous. And I think there's something really magical in that.
Yes, 100%. I mean, not to like agree with myself, but yeah, but I wholeheartedly agree. And you can actually even see it work really successfully in like large scale games. Like I think that a game that has more ambiguity than others is a game like Cyberpunk 2077,
Mm,
right? For all of its, ups and downs and stuff like that, the core narrative has these moments of ambiguity, and you can tell that those moments land with people so many different ways in the way that they glob onto certain characters or go into photo mode and take pictures with their, their tombs or whatever. Like,
Yep.
they like, there's that level of investment there because of there being space for the player to fill in,
Yeah.
right? I mean, that's like a huge AAA game, and I wouldn't say like, oh yeah, so like model your indie game after that. But I think it's like proof in the pudding, right? It's not, you can do that on a micro scale and you can do that on a macro scale, but looking at the way that when it's implemented very well, the types of awards that happen as a result, as a designer, right, I think can be just really, really worth it.
Awesome. Well, so many great things that we covered today, and you know, it's probably a lot to take in, but if we're going to really distill it down into, let's say, three tip suggestions, based on what we talked about, what would you share with our listeners today?
Oh boy, yeah, yeah, we covered so much ground. I would say, yeah, maybe that last point I would be one of them, right? Don't be afraid of ambiguity, right?
Hmm.
The other thing that I would say is, yeah, like pre-production. Do a lot of pre-production, talk to other people, talk to like experts that maybe are like in the field of something that you're making, talk to other designers. I think that that's something also that people should be doing in pre-production. And I think find a community. We didn't really talk about that so much, but I think that so much of indie game design isn't like, being in solo individual, that we talk about solo devs so much, or we kind of whatever idolize solo devs, but there's really no such thing as that. And that's such a myth that gets, perpetuated in various different ways. But finding a community in which you can bounce ideas off of, share early prototypes, and do the design process kind of transparently with, in a way that then kind of fuels you going forward, I think is the last little bit of advice that I'll share.
Awesome. Well, great tips and everything there. Nicholas, honestly, can't thank you enough. This was a really fun conversation to me, and I hope it was for you folks listening today, and you as well. Nicholas, if people want to reach out, connect, find out more about your games, please share some links with us.
Yeah, totally. And thanks so much, Andrew. This has been a blast. I really appreciate it. You can definitely find me on Blue Sky. I'm just sagames.bluesky.social. And then you can find me on itch, sagames.itch.io. I'm also on LinkedIn too, if that's your thing. Just Nicholas O'Brien, SA Games on there. And then, yeah, those are kind of the main ones. I think these days I'm kind of most active on Blue Sky.
Awesome. Well, Nicholas, again, this has been great. And been a pleasure having you on the show. Can't thank you enough.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrew.
Hey everyone, thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.